On the 17th of January 1961, the first ever democratically elected leader of the Republic of the Congo, which is today known as the DRC or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated. However, even prior to his assassination in January 1961, both the United States of America's Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and the government of Belgium both had plans underway on how they were going to assassinate Patrice Lumumba and make it appear as if this was done by his Congolese rivals. Their opportunity came in January 1961, and the aim of this video is to explain both how and why Patrice Lumumba came to be perceived as such a threat, not just to his Congolese rivals, but also to foreign powers like the United States of America and Belgium, which was the former colonizer of the Congo. Patrice Lumumba came to power as the first democratically elected leader of his country, but just 67 days after assuming power, his government was overthrown by a military coup led by Joseph Desiré Mobutu, who was funded and supported by the United States of America. They removed him from power 67 days after he came to power. But in spite of this, he was still perceived as being such a threat that he had to be killed. And that's what we're going to look at in this video. But before we look at why foreign powers like the United States and Belgium found it necessary to intervene in Congolese political affairs, it's important to understand why the assassination of this one man about 6 decades ago is so important. And one of the reasons that it's so important is today the DRC is known as one of the poorest places of the world. And not only is it one of the poorest places in the world, it is also one of the most war-torn regions in the world. In fact, the deadliest conflict that has ever taken place after the Second World War in any part of the world took place in the Congo, known as the Second Congo War, in which it's estimated that about 5.4 million people died. This, along with the First Congo War, led to millions of people being displaced from their homes, and the Congo is characterized as being an area of poverty, of violence. Stories abound of women being raped by soldiers, children being raped by soldiers. It is one of the most poorest places. When we think of poverty and destitution and famine, we think of places like the DRC. But in spite of this, the DRC is one of the richest places, if not the richest places, in terms of mineral resources in any part of the world. All the laptops that we use, all the cell phones that we use, and electric car batteries are dependent on a substance known as cobalt. 3/4 of the world's cobalt supply comes from the DRC. But the condition in which this cobalt is mined represents some of the most horrendous worker conditions. Child labor is often used. Children experience many health problems mining this cobalt. And the wealth is not actually coming to the benefit of the Congolese people, but is benefiting warlords and criminals. And why is the Congo in such a state where today we regard it as being such a failed state? It has so much potential, so much resources, yet it's in such poverty. And one of the obvious answers would be to look at its colonial past. And it had one of the worst colonial pasts. But the fact that after colonialism, its leaders never had the opportunity to right the wrongs of colonization is what is the focus of this video. Because Patrice Lumumba, who became the first leader of this new country that broke away from colonialism, never had the opportunity to do what he wanted to do. And we don't know what type of leader he would have been had he assumed power. But the fact that he was overthrown with foreign backing and then assassinated, we do know what happened. What followed was chaos, devastation, and violence. After Lumumba was removed from power by Joseph Desiré Mobutu, the next 5 years would be characterized by what is known as the Congo crisis, in which the country fragmented between rival groups. And Joseph Desiré Mobutu, who took power from Lumumba in 1960, handed power back to a civilian government. In 1965, due to the failures of the civilian government, Mobutu assumed power once again, financed and supported by the United States of America. And now we know what the rest of Congo's history would be like. Absolute poverty, absolute corruption. Joseph Desiré Mobutu, who changed his name to Mobutu Sese Seko, became the stereotypical image we have when we think of the African dictator. He completely plundered the Congo's resources. In spite of all its resources, the Congolese people lived in abject poverty during Mobutu's reign, while Mobutu and his entourage had large amounts of wealth. And most of the foreign aid that was coming to Africa was being used to prop up Mobutu's government and to keep him in power so he could use the money to bribe off any rival politician that is a threat to his power, or to have them crushed and eliminated. One of the ironies about Lumumba and Mobutu is that one of the reasons that Patrice Lumumba was removed from power and assassinated was that he was perceived as a communist. But the way in which Mobutu ran the Congo is probably a better example of some of the tenets of socialism or communism. He nationalized a lot of Congo enterprises and completely ruined the Congolese economy. He also modeled himself on Mao Zedong. But as long as Mobutu was in power, the West knew that they had an ally who could prevent a rival from coming to power. And during the Cold War period, where the United States was so concerned about Soviet influence in the Congo, someone like Mobutu, who would be loyal to the West, was seen as an alternative. When the Cold War came to an end, then Mobutu would eventually be removed from power. And it would be the consequence of what happened in a neighboring country known as Rwanda. In 1994, the Rwandan genocide, in which 1 million people were massacred, predominantly of the Tutsi ethnic group, but also moderate Hutus as well. So in Rwanda, there's another story for another day. But during the Rwandan genocide, in 3 months, 1 million Rwandans were massacred by other Rwandans. And this led to Paul Kagame, who was uniting the Tutsis and going to overthrow the government responsible for the genocide. Eventually, those Hutus refugees fled into neighboring Congo, which at this stage Mobutu had changed the name to Zaire, and Mobutu's government harbored these Hutus. Eventually, the Rwandan armed forces came in and they overthrew Mobutu, replaced him with Kabila. Kabila came to power, had the similar challenges that Mobutu faced, and eventually Kabila would be overthrown from power in the event that would become known as the Second Congo War. And in spite of all the stories of corrupt politicians, the Congolese people continue to remain in poverty and destitution. And we can trace this back to the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Now, just before we get into the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, it's just important to just outline some of the characteristics of this region that's known as the DRC, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, to understand why it was the challenges that Lumumba faced when he came to power, and how this country descended into such chaos. The colonization of the Congo was different to the colonization of other parts of Africa. It has a unique experience with colonialism. Unlike all the other regions of Africa that were colonized by European powers, the Congo wasn't colonized by a European government, but by one individual, King Leopold II of Belgium. King Leopold colonized the Congo through an organization that he established, and it became more of his private colony, which he used to extract wealth, as opposed to the Belgian government running it. Now, the story of how King Leopold came to colonize the Congo, how he used trickery to get 450 different chiefs in the Congo to make it appear as if they gave him access to the land, is another story for another day. And I will make a video on that, but in the meantime, there are plenty of good videos on that on YouTube. But what's important to take note of is that this huge region in the center of Africa was not homogeneous, it was not unified, it had no history. It was just where King Leopold managed to get an explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, to sign devious treaties with various chiefs. And once he had those treaties, he was able, during the Berlin Conference, to convince the rest of Europe to give him access to this huge territory. And when he got access to this territory, he ruled it in one of the most brutal examples of colonialism. During the Holocaust, Hitler killed about 6 million Jews, which is a huge number. But it's estimated that during King Leopold's reign over the Congo, what he called the Congo Free State, from 1885 until 1908, it's estimated that half the population died, 10 million. It's estimated that there were 20 million people in the Congo in 1885, and in 1908 there were only 10 million because of the way in which Leopold ruled this colony. He ruled it in a very brutal manner for extraction of resources. First ivory, later rubber. Brutal regime. They would use a whip made of hippopotamus skin, which had serrated edges to inflame victims. Later, during the rubber boom, they would capture hostages and order the men to collect rubber and in return of those hostages. They were chopping off of people's hands, chopping off of people's feet. It was one of the most brutal examples of colonialism. Due to the work of a number of philanthropists, missionaries, and journalists, Leopold was gradually exposed, but before the scandal got too out of hand, he sold the colony to the Belgian government and he died the following year. So in 1908, he sold the colony to the Belgian government, and in 1909, he died, never being punished for his atrocities in the Congo. But now Belgium, the small country in Europe, which is 76 times smaller than the Congo, has inherited this huge territory made up of a number of different chiefdoms. They inherited after Leopold wrought this devastation. Belgium did not want a colony. They never set out to have a colony. Leopold acted in his own capacity as an individual, as a greedy monarch in Europe who got this colony. Now Belgium inherited. But once they inherit the colony, they end up finding out that it has so much potential for wealth. When Belgium took the colony, they sent in colonial administrators, Christian missionaries, and concession companies. The colonial administrators would be in charge of running the affairs, Christian missionaries would be in charge of education, and concession companies would be in charge of financing the project. But there was so much copper, manganese, uranium, so much resources, diamonds, that the Belgian economy became more and more dependent on the wealth that it generated through this Congo. So from 1908, when they got the colony from Leopold, until the Second World War in 1945, they could not conceive a future without this colony because it was generating them so much wealth. Whereas the other European powers were making provisions and trying to educate African children, and the whole idea of when they leave, they would educate a new force that would run the country. Belgium was not thinking like this. They had an idea that they thought they would provide basic amenities to the Congolese people, and in exchange, the Congolese people would allow them to stay there forever. That was the way in which Belgium ran their colony. There was no idea, no anticipation, no speaking about decolonization. It wasn't a possibility. This was seen as something that would continue forever. But after the Second World War, a number of changes are going to happen, and other African colonies are going to start fighting for their independence, and the people in Congo are going to do the same. And Patrice Lumumba would emerge as one of these people who would do the same. Now, Patrice Lumumba, who was born as Isaiah Tasumbu Towasa in 1925 in Kasai province of the Batatela ethnic group. His name was later changed to Patrice Lumumba, which means in crowd. He was born in a small rural area which was known for rubber farming. In 1944, he eventually went to Stanleyville, and he had only 4 years of primary school education, but he took 1 year of training to be a postal office worker, and he started working at the post office. Through education, he got his, even though I say through education, in the Congo, education wasn't provided for African children. And the type of education was very rudimentary. And although Patrice Lumumba only had 4 years primary school education and 1 year's post office work training, he was still more educated than the vast majority, and he tried to apply to be an evaluator, or which was seen as being one of the more civilized forms of Congolese, and they would be allowed to go into whites-only shops, and they would enjoy certain privileges. And Patrice Lumumba was originally a supporter of King Leopold and Henry Morton Stanley, who was the explorer that King Leopold used to colonize the Congo. But as time went on, he began to realize the atrocities that Leopold had committed. Patrice Lumumba became more and more involved in politics. 1955, when King Baudouin visited the Congo. Patrice Lumumba made an impression. He went to Belgium as well, but then when he returned, he was arrested for embezzlement during his working in the post office. It was seen that he was taking monies from some accounts and moving money around, and he would later claim that he did this to educate his 3 children so he could send them to better schools. He spent a short time in prison in which he wrote a book called The Congo, My People. And when he came out of prison, he started to get more involved in politics. Now, in 1957, what was once called the Gold Coast, but now called Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah led it to independence. And when news of Ghana's independence broke out, it inspired the Congolese people. And also next to what we today is known as the DRC, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Belgium Congo, next to that is another country called Congo, which is French Congo, sometimes called Congo Brazzaville. And Charles de Gaulle, the Prime Minister of France, visited French Congo. And he told the people that they would have the vote whether they want to remain a part of the French Empire or whether they want independence. So various things like this, and like Kwame Nkrumah liberating Ghana, getting independence from Great Britain, became inspirational for the Congolese people, and they began to demand independence. And the first political body that was established in the Congo was a political body called ABACO, led by Joseph Kasavubu, which sought to unite the Bakongo ethnic group. Patrice Lumumba, he would establish his own political organization called the MNC, the National Movement for the Liberation of the Congo, National Movement Liberation. Now, along with Patrice Lumumba's MNC and Joseph Kasavubu's ABACO, there were many other political associations that were established. You know, in 1957, with Kwame Nkrumah's liberating Ghana and it getting its independence, it was very inspirational, and so many different political associations were established in the Congo. But what made Patrice Lumumba's MNC unique is that it was kind of like a Pan-African organization. It sought to unite all the different groups within the Congo and create one national Congolese identity, whereas the other associations were more concerned with either promoting an ethnicity or promoting a regional identity. For example, ABACO sought to unite the historical Bakongo kingdom, and hence the Bakongo, which was a huge ethnic group that was during the scramble for Africa, would be divided into Belgium Congo, French Congo, and Angola. Most of these organizations were like that, promoting an ethnic identity, whereas Patrice Lumumba's MNC sought to just create a unified Pan-African sort of identity. Another organization to take note at this time was CONACAT, led by Moise Chombe, who was the son of a wealthy businessman in Elizabethville, or the Katanga province of the Congo. Very, very rich in copper, and a multinational, very powerful Belgian company called Union Miniere was located over there. Now, as far as how Congo got its independence, in Keven Shillington's 4th edition of his History of Africa, he makes a very interesting point that in the previous editions he would tell the story in a specific way, and now new evidence, Luto de Witto, a Dutch journalist who had access to UN archives, Belgium archives, has uncovered a different version of the story. So he makes mention of this in his 4th edition, Keven Shillington. But just what's important to take note, the conventional story of how Congo's independence was brought about is communicated in this way. And the idea is that Belgium had run the Congo in such a way that it was not ready for colonialism. In the 1959 to 1960 academic year, only 136 secondary school graduates emerged in a country as large as the Congo. Only 136 people had completed secondary education or high school, and only 30 university graduates in this huge country. As far as the civil service goes, only 3 Congolese had had any experience in civil services, and 2 were recent appointments. When Belgium ruled the colony, they were creating a colony where all the administrative tasks, the running of the country, were done by whites, and Africans never had experience. The highest job they could get would be a mechanic, primary school teacher, etc. They couldn't become a lawyer or an engineer. This was the status quo. So when Ghana got its independence, and the Congolese demanded it, Belgium was caught off guard and Congo wasn't ready for independence. But due to a number of political organizations being established, there were countrywide riots and devastation. Bako led a demonstration. The police put that down violently. The King Baudouin tried to visit. His plane was stopped off at the airport because of rioters, and it looked like the country was going to descend into chaos. And Belgium wanted to avoid a similar situation that the French had faced in one of their colonies, Algeria, where the Algerians fought for independence. The French refused to give independence, and hence you had this Algerian civil war. A powerful country like France was caught up in a violent civil war in Algeria, unable to contain the anti-colonial sentiments. So the last thing a smaller, less powerful country like Belgium wanted to do is get caught up in a similar event in the Congo. So they invited all the leading Congolese officials, including Patrice Lumumba, who was arrested at this time on charges of incitement, and they invited them to Brussels for a roundtable conference. And the official story goes that most of these leaders, these Congolese politicians, disagreed with each other on almost every issue, but the one thing that they were determined was that they wanted Belgium out, and they wanted immediate independence. And hence independence had to be done, elections would have to be done in May 1960 for a new government. So the idea was that Belgium had a 5-year plan. The Congolese politicians demanded independence immediately, and they had to rush it for 6 months. But in reality, it wasn't as straightforward as that. The Congolese politicians were willing to negotiate. Patrice Lumumba himself was willing to negotiate a 5-year transition period. But Belgium decided to rush the elections so that Congo would be caught off guard. Just before the elections, Belgium intervened in the way in which the country was administered and divided it up into 6 provinces and gave each province more regional autonomy. So if a situation emerges that a leader in the Congo would emerge that they did not like, they could then still have control over a specific region that they wanted. This will become important later on. So this is what actually happened behind the scenes. The whole traditional narrative that Congo wasn't ready for independence, but because of rioting, Belgium didn't want a similar situation that France faced in Algeria, and therefore they allowed the Congo to get its independence, is not necessarily true. Belgium actually, they decided that it might be better to rush the independence. Congo would be caught off guard, and they could have inexperienced politicians who they could still control and still run the country as they had run it previously. During the elections, Patrice Lumumba's MNC would get more votes than any other of the organizations, but he wouldn't get an absolute majority. So there was the opportunity now for some wheeling and dealing, and a coalition government was established with the 2 main parties that got the most votes, Joseph Kasavubu's Bako and Patrice Lumumba's MNC. Patrice Lumumba would become the prime minister, Joseph Kasavubu will become the president. And this is how it looked. Now, leading up to this, Belgium's hope was that moderates would come to power so that they can continue to run the country as it has been run previously. Remember, they were not ready for independence. They didn't want the Congo to get its independence, but it was a situation that was brought about. So now they have the situation and they want moderates in power, Congolese who they can control. And Patrice Lumumba had developed a reputation, especially in 1958 when he went to the All Africa Conference in Ghana. After Ghana had its independence, he created this image that he was the type of leader that Belgium did not want in the Congo. He was too radical. They wanted moderates. They wanted people who they could control. So they did not like him. Now, on Independence Day, the very famous incident that everybody mentions is that the King of Belgium, King Baudouin, gave a speech, and Patrice Lumumba was not scheduled to speak, but Joseph Kasavubu was. But in King Baudouin's speech, he said that the independence of the Congo is the crowning moment of the genius conceived by his great granduncle, King Leopold II, and King Leopold II continued this with perseverance and courage. And knowing all the atrocities that King Leopold II did during the colonial period, Patrice Lumumba got very angry, and he got up and gave an impromptu speech in which he spoke that the independence was due to the fighting of the Congolese people who demanded their own independence. He pointed out all the atrocities that were done to the Congolese people during Belgian rule. And this speech was very insulting to Belgium and to the Belgian king. The Congolese people in attendance, they cheered this on, but it was seen as a red flag by Belgium. Now, Once Congo gets its independence, here's where things get very chaotic. Within 2 weeks of Congo getting its independence, there's a riot and a mutiny in the army. What happens is that after independence, civilian politicians who prior to independence would have had menial jobs as clerks and would have a very modest lifestyle are suddenly politicians. They have a lot of money, they can buy expensive cars, they have a luxurious lifestyle, they can flaunt their wealth around. Whereas in the army is made up of the Force Publique, which is about 25,000 soldiers, black Congolese soldiers, controlled by a force of 1,100 white Belgian officers. Now, their living standards do not improve after independence. They get paid the same, and now there's some instances of like ill discipline. The commander of the army, Emil Janssen, he calls together soldiers and he writes on the board before independence equals after independence, and he tells them that nothing's going to change. And this makes the soldiers even more angry, and then they start mutiny. They start going on the streets, start rioting, and then all of a sudden, in the international press, blown out of proportion, instances of black soldiers killing whites, raping nuns, attacking priests, and this whole image gets conjured up that, look here, the Congo wasn't ready for independence, Belgium needed to stay. The moment you allow Africans to have independence, this is what happens. They start getting violent, they start rioting, the country descends into chaos. When this happens, number of white Belgian officials flee and go back to Europe. Now this is a problem because up until this point, very, very few Congolese people were allowed during the Belgian colonial period to do the tasks that are required for running a country. So there was a massive drain of skilled personnel who left when this mutiny in the army took place. Belgium told Lumumba to request Belgian assistance. Lumumba did not respond, and hence Belgium sent in Belgian paratroopers to start disarming some of the soldiers who were on mutiny. And during this instant, a province of the Congo known as Katanga, which is where the copper is, which is where the Union Miniere, this wealthy Belgian company, is, Moise Tshombe unilaterally declares himself independent, and it's known as the Katanga secession, where he wants to break away from the rest of the Congo. Now, Patrice Lumumba feels that this is Belgium sabotaging his independence. They did not like him. They didn't want to give the Congo independence. Now the Congo has independence, and now they are intentionally undermining Congolese authority because they have empowered Moise Tshombe to be able to break away from the rest of the Congo. Belgian paratroopers go in, they disarm the rebelling soldiers, they now arm Moise Tshombe. The Union Miniere pays its taxes not to Lumumba and Kasavubu's government, but to Moise Tshombe's government. He uses this money, they pay him a year's taxation in advance, and he uses this money to get mercenaries from various different places, from South Africa, from Rhodesia, which is today Zimbabwe, southern Rhodesia, and he has his own very, very powerful army. And Lumumba appeals to the United States and to the United Nations to intervene, because according to him, what Belgium is doing is a contravention of the United Nations. Okay, the all people's right to self-determination. Belgium is undermining the sovereignty of an independent country, and the United Nations needs to intervene because the Congo is a newly independent country. Belgium is more powerful, and now they are undermining the legitimacy of this government. Now, the United Nations assembles a task force that goes into the Congo, but they don't have the mandate to attack Katanga or to end the Katangan succession. What they do is they get a task force of Africans from various parts of Africa, particularly Ghana, who have the experience of running a country, and they fulfill all those tasks that the Belgians whites left behind when they fled the Congo, when the soldiers were mutinying. Lumumba demands that they do more, and that he demands that they end the Katangan succession, but they don't have the authority to do that. During this period, CIA officials and US diplomats and UN personnel start to have this very negative view of Patrice Lumumba. He doesn't speak in the way they expect an African to speak to them. This was one of the reasons that the Belgian government did not like him either. He didn't have that polish and that way of almost appeasing Europeans. But also he made threats. Now the United Nations task force that came into the Congo, they, as far as they're concerned, are providing an important role. They're keeping the country going. But for Lumumba, they're not doing enough. He wants them to end the Katanga succession. And he even starts making threats that if they don't end it, he's going to call the Soviet Union. Now this makes Lumumba seen as a very big threat, because in 1959, in Cuba, Fidel Castro had led the Cuban Revolution, and now he had kind of moved more towards the Soviet bloc. And the world at this stage is characterized by a bipolar division between the United States of America and the Soviet Union. And Lumumba is becoming to be seen as a threat, or a perceived threat, that he could enable the Soviet Union to infiltrate Africa. At this point in time, the Soviet Union don't actually have the capacity to do that. But it's a very scary time during the Cold War, and the United States begin to perceive Lumumba more and more as a communist. Now, Lumumba doesn't see it this way. As far as he's concerned, he's just a nationalist trying to unite his country. He can't compete with Belgium. They are too powerful. But they are empowering a rival, to Moise Tshombe, to fragment this country. This country, which got its independence, is now breaking apart because of Belgian interference, and he needs outside support. The United Nations are not helping him. He also travels to the United States impromptu, unexpectedly. He goes to visit Eisenhower. Eisenhower is unable to see him, but when he goes to the United States, again, he doesn't make a very good impression amongst the individuals that he meets in the United States of America. And when he returns to the Congo, not able to get the assistance that he requires, he's now faced with another predicament. Not only is Katanga breaking away, but another province of the Congo, known as South Kasai, which is rich in diamonds, is now breaking away. So now he's got another example of a secession on his hands. And it's this stage that Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union offers him support to get his troops from Leopold, the capital, all the way to South Kasai to end the South Kasai secession. He requires trucks and aircraft, and the Soviets provide it. Once Lumumba does this, his fate is sealed, and it's now clear that he is going to become the enemy. On the 15th of August, he gets Soviet assistance. And by the 18th of August, it's believed that Eisenhower authorized his assassination, because this is seen as a very dangerous time during the Cold War confrontation, or the Cold War conflict. And the CIA will plot various ways of how they're going to assassinate Patrice Lumumba. Now, while he does this, he makes more enemies. Now, when he gets Soviet assistance, he sends the troops to go to South Kasai and end the secession over there, and they massacre a lot of Baluba tribesmen, and that makes him more enemies. He also has a fallout with his chief of staff, Joseph Desiree Mobutu. Now, Joseph Desiree Mobutu was a former soldier in the Belgian army. After he was discharged from the army, he worked as a freelance journalist. He became the personal aide of Patrice Lumumba. And when the mutiny took place in the army and Janssen wrote on the board, before independence equals after independence, Lumumba responded by replacing top Belgian officers with Congolese, and he empowered Victor Ndula as the commander of the army and Joseph Desiree Mobutu as the chief of staff. But now, during this foray in South Kasai, Mobutu is going to have a fallout, and he's going to become increasingly critical of Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba ends the Katanga succession, and during this South Kasai succession, not the Katanga succession, he's unable to do that yet. But during this instance, the United States of America began plotting his assassination. Larry Devlin, the CIA official who's stationed in the Congo at this time, he receives orders that a person named Joe is going to come and is going to give him instructions on how to murder Lumumba. Sidney Gottlieb, a individual, comes, gives Larry Devlin a kit, he tells Larry Devlin, you need to put this on Patrice Lumumba's toothpaste. It's a type of poison that will give him a condition which is similar to polio, but it's a type of disease which is indigenous to the Congo. Larry Devlin decides not to do it, various reasons. He doesn't want to get that involved. He also doesn't see it practical as how he's going to actually get anyone to enter into Lumumba's house in order to poison the toothpaste. But Larry Devlin is also hoping that they can have another way of eliminating Lumumba. In the meantime, the Belgians are plotting their own assassination attempt on Lumumba, which is called Operation Barracuda. So both the CIA and Belgium are plotting ways in which they can assassinate Lumumba, who's being perceived as a threat. Now, during this time, the United Nations, the CIA, Belgium do not like Lumumba, and they are looking for an alternative. Joseph Kasavubu is the president, so they put more pressure on Kasavubu. Kasavubu eventually responds, and he goes onto the radio stations and he says that as president of the Congo, he is dismissing Patrice Lumumba as prime minister. But when he does that, Lumumba does the same, and he goes into the radio station and he says as prime minister he's dismissing Kasavubu. The rest of the government don't give either the authority to do that. So the whole situation is a mess now. If you're the ordinary Congolese person on the street, you know that there's a mutiny in the army, you know that there's chaos, you know a lot of white civilians have left the Congo, went back to Europe, the United Nations are here, and now you hear the prime minister dismiss the president dismiss the prime minister, and you don't know where things stand. This time, Mobutu is getting funded by the Americans, and he becomes closer and closer with Larry Devlin, the CIA official who's in charge of the Congo, and they support Mobutu, and Mobutu will have a coup d'etat, and he will take control over the government, and he will declare a coup. But when he does this, he puts Lumumba under house arrest, but he allows Kasavubu to continue, and Kasavubu will then replace Lumumba with another prime minister. So Kasavubu is now, Lumumba is now isolated and under house arrest. And the United Nations plays an important role in disempowering Lumumba during this time. They close down the airports, so troops who are loyal to Lumumba can't come to Lumumba's residence in Leopold and help him escape, because remember, the capital of the Congo is Leopold, but the majority of Patrice Lumumba's supporters come from Stanleyville, which is much further away. So the United Nations play a role there. They also close down the radio station, so Lumumba cannot make an appeal to the people to explain what's going on. So he's isolated, he's under house arrest. The UN troops surround his residence to protect him, and around them is Mobutu's troops to prevent Lumumba from escaping. And he's in an increasingly precarious position, while the United States and Belgium are contemplating the idea of how they can assassinate him or eliminate him, so that he can never be a threat again. Now, while this is happening, Lumumba's situation is very dire. The country is completely fragmenting. A pro-Lumumba government comes to power in Stanleyville. You've got Mobutu and Kasavubu in Leopoldville claiming the legitimate government. You got the Katangan succession with Moise Tshombe, and you got South Kasai. So you can think of the Congo now as having 4 governments. Lumumba is very, very desperate to escape. And in November, during a tropical downpour, he sneaks away and tries to escape to get to Stanleyville, where he can align himself with his supporters and be able to get control back of the country. When he escapes, Mobutu's soldiers are obviously going to be chasing him down, tracking him down. Now, Lumumba makes the mistake. Instead of getting to Stanleyville as quickly as he can, because he has been silenced for such a long period of time when the radio stations are closed, he feels it necessary to stop off wherever he can and give speeches. This slows down his journey, and it makes it very easy for Mobutu to capture him. Mobutu catches him, brings him back to Leopoldville. But during this time, the troops that are guarding Lumumba are very influenced by Lumumba. He has this ability to tell the troops, why are you listening to Mobutu, who's a sellout or a puppet of the West? I'm the person who's trying to liberate this country. I'm the person who wants to help us overcome the challenges, the poverty of colonialism, etc. And his message resonates amongst the soldiers, and the soldiers who are guarding Lumumba start to riot, and Mobutu has to rush there with more American money to try and bribe the soldiers to be loyal to him. And this increasingly fuels the idea that as long as Lumumba is alive, he's always going to be a threat. Now Belgium and the United States become more increasingly concerned with Lumumba. What eventually happens is they take Lumumba to Thijsville, and then the idea is they're going to take him to Katanga to meet Moise Tshombe. And the idea is that they'll create the story that Lumumba was arrested in Katanga, where he is very unpopular, and he tries to break out and he gets murdered by native patriotic Congolese. What really happens is he's brought before a firing squad First of all, he's beaten, he's humiliated. Moise Chombe beats him. They hit him with the butt end of a rifle. They take the speech that he gave during Independence Day, where he gave that speech after King Baudouin annoyed him with his speech. Lumumba gave his impromptu speech. He had to print it out and distribute it. So they squash it up, put it in his mouth, try to humiliate him as much as they can. Eventually, he's executed by a firing squad of Belgian officers and Katangese soldiers. They quickly bury the body and they leave it. And then they have this cover-up story of how Lumumba was killed. But then they get worried, what if those bodies get uncovered? So they go back, they cut the bodies up, they burn it, they dissolve it in sulfuric acid, and all that remains of Patrice Lumumba is the gold caps on 2 of his teeth, which only in 2022, which was last year, did Belgium ever return back to the Congo. And that's basically the story of how Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. After Lumumba's assassinations, things do not get any better. The Congo crisis, as it became known as, will continue until 1965, when Mobutu will have a second coup d'etat. Why was Lumumba assassinated? It's very controversial and it's very difficult to explain, but Patrice Lumumba has made it very clear that he's the type of leader that is not going to be a puppet of Belgium. And Belgium wanted someone who they could control, and Lumumba made very clear he's not the type of leader that they could control. The mutiny in the army that followed and led to the Katangan succession was one of the crises. During that period, the United States, which was supporting Belgium, also began to perceive Lumumba as someone that they do not want in power. And for these various reasons, and during the Cold War conflict, they felt it necessary to assassinate Lumumba. We don't know what Lumumba would have done had he continued to be prime minister. We don't know what other challenges would have occurred. But it's hard to imagine a situation that would be worse than what eventually happened in the Congo during Mobutu's rule. After Lumumba's assassination, descended chaos for the next few years until Mobutu's second coup d'etat. And then when Mobutu came to power, after his second coup d'etat in 1965, the story of the Congo, the story of dictatorship, the story of corruption would characterize the Congo. Thank you.